yaitu dengan diresmikannya Universitas Terbuka.
Berdiri pada 4 September 1984, UT langsung berlari untuk menciptakan inovasi dan terobosan baru dalam bidang pendidikan tinggi terbuka dan jarak jauh di tanah air. Lahirnya UT membuktikan komitmen pemerintah untuk memeratakan akses pendidikan tinggi yang berkualitas tanpa batas. Hampir 2 juta alumni UT tersebar di tanah air dan mancanegara dengan beragam profesi dan keahlian. Hal itu menunjukkan UT telah berhasil melaksanakan mandat pemerintah. Kemajuan teknologi, perubahan kebutuhan masyarakat, tuntutan pemerintah menjadikan UT sebagai institusi pendidikan yang matang, kuat, dan visioner.
Dengan status baru sebagai perguruan tinggi negeri Badan Hukum atau PTNBH, UT tetap pada jati dirinya, yaitu menyediakan akses pendidikan tinggi yang terjangkau biayanya, terjamin kualitasnya, dan tersebar layanannya.
Status PTNBH ini membuat UT sejajar dengan PTN lain yang sudah lebih lama didirikan. Status ini juga membuat UT semakin otonom dalam pengelolaan akademik, tata kelola, pengelolaan keuangan dan aset, serta sumber daya manusia. Empat 43 program pendidikan jenjang diploma, sarjana, magister, dan doktor yang ada saat ini dapat dikembangkan lebih cepat sesuai dengan permintaan dan kebutuhan masyarakat. Menyadari kompleksitas, pekerjaan, koordinasi, dan tuntutan akurasi yang sangat tinggi, UT mengembangkan berbagai aplikasi.
Semua aplikasi itu disatukan dalam digital learning ecosystem.
Dengan selalu mendapatkan opini audit laporan keuangan wajar tanpa pengecualian, UT senantiasa berkomitmen penuh untuk menjadi institusi pendidikan tinggi yang transparan, akuntabel, efektif, efisien, dan ekonomis.
UT menerapkan standar yang tinggi untuk bahan ajar, proses pembelajaran, dan asesmen hasil belajar. Dengan demikian, para mahasiswa dimanapun mereka berada diharapkan akan memiliki standar kompetensi minimal yang sama.
Jejaring kerjasama yang kuat membuat UT menjadi institusi yang semakin berkembang, maju, besar, dan terpercaya.
Dan maju bersama dalam tatanan baru UT PTNBH.
Universitas Terbuka bersiap menyusun tantangan dunia, berperan serta mencerdaskan bangsa, menjangkau
Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan Rahayu. Very good morning. First of all, I would like to say hello to all ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here. Welcome to the Visiting Professor Program organized by Fisheries Management Master Program of Universitas Terbuka with a theme Challenges for Sustainable Fisheries Management, a perspective developed from experience in Australia and Indonesia. First of all, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Head of the Graduate Program, whom I respect, Dr. Siti Juleha, MA. She is Head of Director of Universitas Terbuka Graduate Program. Allow me to extend our warmest greeting to the Honorable Speaker, Professor Neil Lorenegan. He is a professor of marine ecology and conservation at Murdoch University, Western Australia, and also as president of the 14th Asian Fisheries Society. All colleagues, professor, lecturer, researcher, honorable guests, and students of UT Fisheries Management Program, and ladies and gentlemen, participants of webinar visiting program organized by Universitas Terbuka. I'm Agnes Puspitar Sari Sudarmo, very honored to be the host and also the moderator for today's event. It is great pleasure for me to welcome you to the Visitor Professor Program and acquaint you in a session event organized by Fishery Management Master Program of Universitas Terbuka. Ladies and gentlemen, in this beautiful morning, let us be grateful that we gather here by Zoom and by UTTV channel YouTube to share and, of course, to gain knowledge from current development related to the theme of the Visitor Professor Program, Challenges for Sustainable Fisheries Management, a perspective developed from experience in Australia and Indonesia. Hoping from this webinar, we can learning sustainable fisheries management not only from Indonesian perspective, but also from Australia perspective. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to read the agenda of today's program, which will be started by, first, opening ceremony started by singing Indonesian national anthem Indonesia Raya, followed by hymn Universitas Terbuka. And second, welcoming speech by Head of Director of Graduate Studies of Universitas Terbuka, Dr. Siti Juleha, followed by officially opening the event. And third is the keynote speech from Professor Neil Lorenegan, this Professor of Marine Ecology and Conservation from Murdoch University, Australia. The next agenda is the question and answer session and followed by closing ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the agenda for today's program. Without any further ado, we start our opening ceremony. We will sing the national anthem of Republik Indonesia. For participants on Zoom, we would like to invite you to remain seated. Next, let us continue to hear the welcoming speech from Universitas Terbuka Director of Graduate Program and formally open the event. Please welcome Dr. Siti Juleha, MA.
Thank you, Bu Agnes. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful, may peace, mercy, and blessing of Allah be upon you. Distinguished speaker, Dr. Neil Lonergan, Professor Emeritus of Marine Ecology and Conservation from Murdoch University, Western Australia. Welcome to Universitas Terbuka via daring. And also he is a young professor at IPB University and president of Asian Fisheries Society. The Honorable Dr. Agnes Puspitasari Sudarmo, MA, Head of the Fishery Management Master Program from Universitas Terbuka, and dear colleagues, students of the Fishery Management Master Program from Universitas Terbuka and other participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning, best wishes for all of us. First of all, I would like to invite all to praise and gratitude to the presence of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the Almighty God who has bestowed the blessing of health on all of us so that we can attend and participate in the event of visiting a professor program. For fellow students, we need to convey again that one of the profiles of graduates from the Master of Fishery Management at Universitas Terbuka is as professionals and practitioners who are able to solve and provide innovative solutions to fishery management issue, phenomena, problem with a holistic and innovative approach to support sustainable fishery development. As we know, marine fisheries resources are open access so that they can be utilized by all parties. With the nature of open access, this has consequences for the tendency for excessive utilization and is not environmentally friendly and without being balanced with maintenance of sustainability. This certainly has a negative impact both for the fishery resources themselves and also for the surrounding environment. Challenges for sustainable fisheries management a perspective developed from experience in Australia and Indonesia is a very interesting theme and is one of the important issues today in the fisheries sector in the world, including in Indonesia and Australia. Distinguished college, honorable guests, and participants, sustainable fisheries management is an effective and appropriate way to find out the extent to which fishery resources are utilized and appreciated. Through systematic and holistic fishery management, it is expected that the management of marine fisheries in all Indonesian waters and seas will become more efficient in the context of achieving the development goals of the Indonesian fisheries sector. One of the important points in sustainable fisheries management is cooperation, both bilateral and international. So the G20 summit, which just took place on November 15 to 16, is an important momentum for global leadership commitment in supporting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Nah, Indonesia fully supports every activity that benefits marine and coastal resources. In support of this, the Indonesian government held Road to Ocean 20 workshop on blue carbon of seagrass, ecosystem, and livelihood in Labuan Bajo, Nusa Tenggara. The meeting was attended by international experts in their fields, and one of them was Andy Stephen, CSIAO from the Australia. Besides Stephen, Nikki Fitzgerald from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, who also represented the Australian government, stated that seagrass beds are ecosystems that receive less attention when compared to mangrove and coral reefs. Therefore, there is a very good momentum to increase capacity and awareness in protecting the ecosystem, where Indonesia is a country that has the largest seagrass ecosystem area in the world. In this collaboration, Indonesia and Australia will support each other in the development of blue economy and blue carbon to create healthy and sustainable seas by fighting unsustainable fishing and crime, especially in the fisheries sector. It is our hope that this Indonesia-Australia collaboration will provide new hope and at the same time address major challenges in sustainable fishery management in Indonesia and Australia. So in this webinar, we really hope that Professor Neil Lonergan provides knowledge and information to all of us regarding challenges for sustainable fisheries management. Thereby, we are adding to our insights and way of thinking about good and sustainable fishery resources management. Thank you for Neil for sharing your knowledge and experience with all of us. We also express our gratitude to all students and lecturers as well as other audience in this webinar. To all committees, thank you for all the work dedicated until today. And ladies and gentlemen, I officially open the webinar with the theme Challenges for Sustainable Fishery Management, a perspective developed from experience in Australia and Indonesia by saying the Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hopefully, today's webinar runs smoothly and successfully and become a blessing and addition to all of our worship can increase. To all students, we wish you good luck participating in and listening to the webinar. We hope that your insight and understanding of efforts to manage balance in the use of fishery resources will increase. Keep learning, have a pleasant time, keep the spirit, stay healthy and happy. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. I return to Bu Agnes.
Thank you, Dr. Siti Julaiha MA, for warm welcome and had officially opened the event. Before we start the main event, let me read some rules in order to agenda run smoothly. The webinar rules: keep your microphone mute and use the virtual background that we have provided. Please write your name and organization as identification. For example, Stephen _ Universitas Terbuka. To raise a question, type in the chat box with the format, name, organization, and question. And the other is, if you use the raise hand feature, you can want to speak or ask question. And the last one, the evaluation link will be posted at the end of the session. Ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to introduce our honorable speaker. It is an honor for having Professor Neil to stand in front of us to deliver a presentation. Before the presentation begins, allow me to read the curriculum vitae of Professor Neil. Professor Emeritus Neil Lorenagan is a professor of marine ecology and conservation at Murdoch University, Western Australia. And prior to this was the inaugural chair of Fisheries Science, leader of the Environmental and Conservation Science at Murdoch University, and chaired the board of the Asian Research Center at Murdoch University. He had researched a wide area, especially in fish and invertebrate ecology, estuarian and marine food webs, stock enhancement and small-scale fishery, and besides that, he supervised the graduate research student in this area. Before joining Murdoch University, he spent 14 years with JSRRO based in Brisbane, working on prawn fisheries and habitats in Northern Australia and throughout Southeast Asia. He is also a young professor at IPB University, Bogor, Indonesia. Also working together with Dr. Adrian Hortiok, an Indonesia collaborator, particularly with Dr. Budi Wirjawan, run workshop on fisheries science and management strategy evaluation for data limited species. If you're interested, you can browse at https://researchrepository.murdoch.edu.au. Professor Neil has been a member of the Asian Fisheries Society since 2004 and AFS Council from 2011 until 2016. And in 2019 up to now, Professor Neil is the president of the 14th Council of the Asian Fisheries Society. He was also co-organizer of the 7th Indo-Pacific Fish and ESPB Conference in 2009 and the 4th International Symposium on Stock Enhancement and Sequencing in collaboration with Asian Fisheries Society as part of the 4th Asian Fisheries Forum in Shanghai in 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, you could see profile publication of Prof. Neil in Google Scholar and Scopus. And ladies and gentlemen, now we finally arrived at at the main agenda in a few moments. We will hear a keynote speech presentation from Professor Neil. We will listen to the presentation of current issue related to our theme today, challenges for sustainable fisheries management, a perspective developed from experience in Australia and Indonesia. Therefore, I would like to invite Professor Neil to deliver his presentation. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Neil to present and to deliver the presentation. All right, Professor, I will please welcome Professor Neil Lorenagan.
Thank you for the very warm welcome, people. I hope that you can hear me clearly. I will just start sharing my screen and we can start the presentation. Are we able to see the screen now?
Yeah, good.
Very good.
Now, yeah.
And okay.
Okay.
So today we're looking at sustainable fisheries management and some perspectives from both Australia and Indonesia. So when I talk about an Australian perspective, sorry, I'm just getting going here. It's important to remember where that is. We come from the south. We have a bit of a different view. I am based in Perth. And it's important to recognise that we have a small population size covering a large area compared with the population of Indonesia. I really want to cover four main topics in this presentation, a little bit of background of my journey in fisheries. I will probably keep that very brief. We'll then look at world capture fisheries and Indonesia's place and the place of Asia in world capture fisheries. We'll then consider components of fisheries and fisheries as systems, looking at Australian fisheries, but then moving on to small-scale fisheries and their significance in Indonesia, and how we can approach the assessment and management of small-scale fisheries. So I've had four major phases in my research career, starting in Perth for undergraduate and postgraduate studies, then going to Canada before ending in Brisbane, and then moving back to Perth at Murdoch University. But the Indonesian perspective is the fifth phase in my research career and has been developed since about 2014, and particularly through collaborations with EPB University and MMAF, and running workshops on fisheries. And I've been fortunate to have worked with Pak Budi Wirawan and Pak Fayakun Satria in particular at MMAF. And this shows the participants from the 2015 workshop on fisheries assessment, and then a very important one on data-limited fisheries and management strategy evaluation in 2019. And this is the one in which you're able to look at the proceedings from this workshop from that URL. But also I have provided this reference and a series of references to Universitas Terbuka along with my presentation, and I think that will be accessible after this presentation. I'm a member of the Centre for Sustainable Aquaculture and Ecosystems Research in the Harry Butler Institute at Murdoch University. We have 4 major themes in this research institute. The one of most significance for us is fisheries and aquaculture, which is really aiming to support fisheries management and sustainable fisheries and aquaculture in Australia. And the focus is on fish biology, habitat restoration, stock enhancement, and other components. So some of this work has been going on for over 20 years, and we've built up a knowledge base on over 30 species in southwestern Australia, including information on their life history strategies, their growth, reproduction and feeding. And this has allowed us to look at a comparison of life history strategies across many different families. So on the left of the screen, we have the Cheliodactylae or morwongs, followed by the boarfish, and then in the middle we have the flathead or Platycephalidae, and on the right-hand side we have the Scorpaenidae. So some of the families that we've worked on. But we have very detailed knowledge for species within families, and this is an example of work on the growth strategies within 13 species of the platycephalids or flathead. And you can see that the species at the top of this graph, Platycephalus fuscus, grows to over 1 metre in length by 15 years of age, which is very different from a species such as Platycephalus basensis, which gets to about 400 millimetres of age by 20 years of age. We also see that in 2 different regions, quite different growth rates for a species. So we see variability within family, but also variability within species depending on regions. And some of this work has also highlighted that species get much older than we previously thought. So this is an example from the boarfish on the right-hand side, which grows to an asymptotic length of about 300 millimetres, but it's a very long-lived species, getting up to 50 years of age. And this means that it's a species with low natural mortality, but a relatively high rate of growth to reach that asymptotic length. And this means it has a low ratio of natural mortality to instantaneous growth, and that makes it quite vulnerable to fishing and fishing down the older age groups in the population. We'll now turn to looking at the global fisheries and the importance of small-scale fisheries. And important resources on this are the FAO State of World Fisheries and Aquaculture publications, and the latest one of this came out in 2022. We'll also look at reconstructed catches, which have been produced by the Sea Around Us project, and how there's some differences in the picture that we get depending on whether we're looking at FAO statistics or the reconstructed catches. So in terms of the FAO statistics, we're seeing the production from capture fisheries and aquaculture here from 1950 to 2020. The capture fisheries are shown in blue, and we can see that the production of capture fisheries has plateaued since about 1985. The light blue is marine and the dark blue is aquaculture. We look at a breakdown of these statistics by countries. You can see the importance of China and Indonesia, and in 2020, Indonesia was ranked number 2 in terms of capture fisheries production. We also see the importance of the Asia Pacific region. where 6 of the top 10 producers for capture fisheries are within this region. And when we look at the fleet dynamics within the Asian region, again, we see the very great importance of Asia. It has the largest fleet in the world, with about 75% of the global fishing fleet. And in terms of where Australia sits, it doesn't figure prominently on this figure, but we'll see later on where Australia sits and why it might sit where it is. When we look at a catch reconstruction, and so the catch reconstruction is done by taking into account the unreported catches, which might come from illegal fishing, it might come from small-scale fisheries, and it might come from unreported catches. We can recognise a number large-scale fisheries or industrial fisheries, and a number of small-scale fisheries, artisanal, subsistence and recreational fisheries. The trends in catch we see are quite different from the FAO statistics, in that the FAO statistics plateaued in the mid-1980s, whereas if we take a reconstruction of catches, we can see that they continued to increase until about mid-1990s and then have been declining since around 2000. And when we look within the Asian region, this is work by Tay and Pauly looking at a catch reconstruction for 4 countries, Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam. The scale of the underreported catches is estimated to be similar to the reported catches in the FAO statistics. So catches and fishing effort in small-scale fisheries are often underreported, and this makes quite a challenge for how we assess and manage small-scale fisheries. Next, I'd like to look at components of fisheries and what we need to take into account when we're trying to evaluate fisheries and the status of stocks and the dynamics of the fisheries and how management might be effective or not. A fundamental component of this is the biology of the focus species, that is the target species for the fisheries. And in this we include factors like age and growth, reproduction, diet and habitat behaviour and responses to environment. An increasingly important part of this is not only target species, but marine wildlife species such as dolphins, whale sharks, manta rays and turtles, but also species of sharks fall in this category of wildlife species and but being vulnerable to harvest. We also need to take into account human activities such as fishing, development of port facilities, increased boating activities, ship strike, tourism, climate change. And these are threats to the sustainability of fish and wildlife populations, and then how we manage the human activities, which is about managing people, not about managing fish. So in terms of both fish species and conservation species, understanding the population biology of species is fundamental to assessing their status and how resilient they are, but also we need to understand the human interactions and impacts on the fish species or wildlife species and what additional mortality the population can sustain. So for fish species, this helps us determine what the harvest levels might be to ensure sustainability. And for conservation species, it helps us interpret additional sources of mortality or threats to the conservation species. And this includes things like their catch in fisheries. It includes things like boat strike or illegal fishing or entanglement in fishing. In terms of resilience to human interactions, understanding biological attributes of the population is important to understanding the resilience of the population to human interactions. And this includes, when we're talking about biology, what's the rate of growth? What is the maximum size achieved? When is energy put into reproduction? And how much energy is put into reproduction? How many eggs are produced? And the breeding behaviour and locations of reproduction. And essentially, when we're talking about this resilience and the species biology, is the species an R or K strategist? And see, these are terms, ecological terms that help us give an understanding of the life history strategies of species. So in terms of R strategist, at the top, we have a typical R strategist, which is a Penaeid prawn or shrimp, a banana prawn, Penaeus indicus, which has a maximum age of about 2 years and an age of maturity of only 3 months. And it produces large numbers of eggs. So hundreds of thousands of eggs by the time they're 6 months old. And this is very different from a K strategist, such as that of the snubfin dolphin, which has a maximum age of 40 years. It doesn't mature until it's between 6 and 10 years old, and it only produces 1 to 2 young and only reproduces every 3 years. So 2 very extremes. And then we have species that fall in the middle of this, such as the tongol, Tanis tongol, which gets to a maximum age of about 30 years old and matures at 3. So fundamental to this is determining the growth, and typically we use the von Bertalanffy growth model to determine growth, and the key parameters are this asymptotic length, the L infinity, and the rate at which the species grows, or the instantaneous rate of growth, K, to get to this maximum length. And the stage at which growth in length starts slowing, this is typically a time of when the fish starts maturing and producing young. On the bottom right of this, we see how we estimate the age or size at maturity using the logistic model, and typically we're interested in that when 50% of individuals within the population are able to reproduce, and this size is a very important size in terms of understanding the species biology and its response to fishing. They're indicators for the population that is being harvested. The other thing we need when we're evaluating fisheries is to understand the performance of the fishery and how we track performance. Walters and Hilborn, about 30 years ago now, recognised different stages in development of the fishery, 6 different stages, and they give 3 indicators of performance that we need to track. Catch, shown by the solid line, fishing effort, shown by the dashed line, and the dotted line is changes in the population abundance. So if you look firstly at changes in catch, we can see that in the pre-development and growth phases of the fishery, catches are relatively low. They then start to increase greatly, and if the fishery is uncontrolled. This is at a point in which we reach a maximum and then there's a collapse in the fishery before stabilisation. If we look at changes in fishing effort shown by the dashed line, we can see that this follows the pattern of catch, but it's delayed slightly, so that fishing effort continues to increase at a time when catches have been declining. And this illustrates a key point in fisheries, and that is that it's very difficult to remove fishing effort in a timely way to manage the catch and abundance of the population, because investment has been made in fishing and it's very hard to wind back this investment. The third indicator is abundance, shown by the dotted line starting at high levels on the left and showing a relatively small decrease in time until we get to the fully exploited phase, in which we see a massive decline in abundance and then a stabilisation and a recovery starts. So key points from this are, as I said, it's very difficult to remove effort from a fishery, but also we need indicators for both the fishery but also the population. So what is the health, or what is the spawning biomass within the population? So in terms of when we're talking about fisheries management, what are the components, or what things do we need to consider for fisheries management? This shows some of the dimensions that we need to consider that all feed in to fisheries management and decision-making on management. On the left-hand side, we have the fishery and the target species population, and we have data on the biology of the species. We have data from the fisheries feeding in to a database system in which we can explore and analyse data. On the lower right-hand side, we have how we analyse the data, what programs and statistics we use, what models we might use to assess the status of the stock, and this feeds into the top, the policy that might be considered in terms of managing the fishery. A simpler way of representing this is to consider the overall fisheries management system as a number of components. So at the top of this diagram, we have the fishery, which includes the target species and the characteristics of the fishing effort, the types of methods that are used. And we then have we have sources of data for the fishery, and this may be, we may have lots of information, data-rich fishery, and we'll see examples of this later, or we may have very limited or very poor data for the fishery. But whatever data are available, we're wanting to be making management decisions in the lower box to ensure that the fishery is sustainable, and then we want to be able to implement these decisions effectively on the left-hand side. And the types of management decisions we make will be dependent on the objectives that we have. And now we have three major categories of objectives to consider. We have the economic or business objectives in the middle. On the left-hand side, we have the social objectives, the livelihoods we wish to support, the food that people eat. And on the right-hand side, we have the ecological or biological objectives of the fishery. And these objectives can then be evaluated under different management actions using management strategy evaluation. And Adrian Hordijk, who's a former PhD student of mine and then went to University of British Columbia, and Tom Corrales have developed a system that allows us to do this, the method evaluation and risk assessment system, which is, and examples of this are given in the proceedings for data limited fisheries in Indonesia, which evaluated 7 different fisheries within Indonesia in the workshops that I mentioned. And in this presentation, we'll be looking at some case studies for shark at the bottom left of the workshop proceedings, and snapper and groper on the top right of the workshop proceedings. And so this method allows us to evaluate different management strategies for fisheries and can be used for certification or for looking at guiding fisheries improvement projects. I'd now like to look at some aspects of Australian and West Australian fisheries and factors that are affecting fish populations in these regions. This map of Australia on the left-hand side of the figure shows the major current systems in Australia. And I think 2 key features are on the west coast. We have the Lewin Current, which emerges from the Indonesian flue throat and flows southwards along the west coast and goes across into the southern regions, depending on the strength of the flow. And on the right-hand side of Australia, on the east coast, we have the East Australian Current, which emerges from tropical currents in the Pacific and then flows southwards. The west coast, both currents are warmer water currents. They're typically low nutrient environments, and this has quite an influence on the characteristics of our fish populations and our ecology, marine ecology around the Australian coast. When we're talking about Australia, it's important to remember that we have a very large exclusive economic zone covering 10 million kilometres squared, and this is the 3rd largest EEZ globally. Indonesia also has a very large exclusive economic zone, number 6. In terms of our fisheries production, globally we rank much lower in terms of weight of production, but this is we'll see that the species produced have very high value. And in terms of people employed, our numbers of people employed directly in fisheries or fish processing are much, much lower than what we see in Indonesia, where we have very significant small-scale fisheries. So our fisheries are in low nutrient environments, and this leads to low fisheries production. Examples of a couple of our large commercial fisheries are the northern prawn or northern shrimp trawl fishery, which covers 6,000 kilometres of coastline, goes across 3 of our northern states, Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia, and has only about 50 trawlers operating within this fishery, which catches 6,000 to 10,000 tonnes of prawns, and it's a multi-species fishery, like many shrimp trawl fisheries globally. A very significant fishery and high-value fishery in Western Australia is the Western rock lobster fishery. It's a spiny lobster, Paniolirus cygnus. It occurs over 800 kilometres of coastline. It was up to 400 boats in 2010, but is now at around 230 boats, which takes 5,000 to 10,000 tonnes of lobster, and it's now managed by a catch quota, which was 6,800 tonnes in 2020. And like the prawns, a lot of the lobster is exported from Australia. So we have And these two fisheries are very data-rich fisheries, and we'll see what that means with an example of the prawns. They cover quite large areas with few boats, small catch, but very high value. And there are fisheries in which we have licences, and the fisheries are required to report monthly catches and fishing effort on their licences. In terms of Western Australia, we consider our fisheries within 4 major bioregions: the North Coast, Gascoyne Coast, West Coast and the South Coast. And this is a region which is a very large area. It covers about 1/3 of Australia, very low population density. It's a region which is the equivalent of the size of Texas, larger than the size of Texas, but it's a population of less than 3 million people within this region. A very extensive geographic area, very large continental shelf area, and we have 50 management fisheries within the region. 40 of them we're able to assess, and some of these, the remaining fisheries, are quite data limited, and these are typically fisheries within our estuaries, remote regions, and being able to do assessments for the non-target species and recreational fisheries within the regions. And recreational fisheries are very significant because a large proportion of people within Western Australia fish at least once a year. So about 30% of our population fish for pleasure. In terms of how we assess fisheries now, we use ecosystem-based fisheries management, which has been in place for over 10 years, in which we do assessments based on the ecology, the socioeconomics, and our ability to achieve successful and sustainable fisheries, so the administration of these fisheries. We've seen significant changes in fisheries management over time, and this is how we assess our fisheries now. But in the 1960s and 1970s, it was very much about attaining a maximum sustainable yield. So what was the maximum harvest that the fishery could produce? And if we're able to take that, we should be able to take that into the future forever and ever. Now, when we're looking at the maximum sustainable yield, the figure on the right shows how the average yield changes with fishing effort. We have 2 0 points on this figure, one where we have no fishing and the other where at extreme levels of fishing we have 0 yield or a commercially extinct fishery. And then there's a sweet spot or the maximum sustainable yield in the middle, which was what originally we were trying to achieve. These goals of fisheries management have evolved over time, so that in the early 1990s, Hilborn and Walters in their book gave a definition which talked about sustainable production of the fish stocks through management and regulation of the fishery to promote economic and social well-being of the fishermen and industries that use the production. So still very much focused on the fishery and industries involved in the fishing. In Australia, this changed with the ecologically sustainable development concept that was brought into Australian fisheries in the early 1990s, which recognised that the fisheries resources were actually a community resource or a common resource. So it was not just about the fishery and the industries involved in the fishery, but it was using, conserving and enhancing the community's resources so that the ecological processes within these systems are maintained and the quality of life now and in the future is increased. And this evolved into ecosystem-based fisheries management, so that this in Western Australia is how it looks for the ecological assessments. On the right-hand side of the ecological assessments, we have the individual elements. The top box is the harvest species, and this is what maximum sustainable yield was about. It was what the Hilbun's and Walter's definition was about, but it also considers other species that are caught within the fisheries and those species that are considered marine wildlife. But on the left-hand side, it also considers the ecological functioning of the marine ecosystem, so community structure and biodiversity. If we look at some of the management options that are implemented in fisheries in Western Australia, I'll just give you a case study of the Exmouth Gull prawn trawl fishery in Western Australia. This is, we control the number of fishes, the trawl boats in the fishery through licences. We have limits on the trawl mesh that can be used. Shown in the map of Exmouth Gulf. On the right-hand side of this map, the blue area is a closed area to trawling to protect the recruits. And in the grey area in the middle of Exmouth Gulf, there's a number of different zones that are opened or closed to protect the spawning stock. This is a fishery in which we have data coming from the fishery. We also have fishery independent data on the recruits, so the small prawns, and this is used to set the opening date, and also on the spawning stock, which is used to determine when to close the fishery. So this is an example of a very data-rich fishery. If we look at some of the data coming from the fishery, this looks at the landings of the tiger prawn, Phaneus esculentus, in the fishery from the start, the discovery phase of the fishery in the 1960s through to 2000, and changes in the landings of tiger prawns. So there's clearly two major phases in the fishery. On the left-hand side of this graph, we have the developing to fully fished and overfished stage of the fishery, where up to 28 boats were involved. And on the right-hand side of this graph, we have the current status of the fishery, or more recent status, in which there's only 10 boats involved and a much reduced fishing effort. We see two major declines in the fishery. The first one in the early 1980s, and this was due to overfishing. And the second one in the late 1990s, which is due to an environmental effect following a major cyclone impacting the juvenile nursery habitats. This shows the life history and the life cycle of the tiger prawn. The mature adults are found in deeper offshore waters. The eggs, fertilised eggs, are released from the adults, and they go through a number of larval stages from the nucleus through to the zoe, the mysis, and the post-larvae, which is the first stage to settle on the bottom. These earlier stages in the larvae are pelagic stages, so they're in the water column and moving up and down in the water column. And the juvenile stages of this particular species on the left-hand side settle out in coastal and estuarine nursery habitats, where seagrass and macroalgae are very important nursery habitats, as well as being important carbon sinks. This second phase collapse in the fishery was caused by a cyclone, and it's the cyclone Vance shown in the middle of the site graph of Exmouth Gulf here. This was a Category 5 cyclone with winds of over 200 kilometres an hour that went through Exmouth Gulf and caused great perturbation or disturbance of the bottom sediments within this Gulf environment, which led to a major loss of seagrass and macroalgae within the Gulf. So 7 months after the cyclone, there was less than 2% cover within the Gulf, shown by the black dots here, and you might be able to see some clear dots, which is where no seagrass or macroalgae was present. Fortunately, the seagrass and macroalgae are quite dynamic, so that 19 months post-cyclone, there was over 20% cover of seagrass within the Gulf. So within this fishery, we were fortunate to have not only data from the fishery, but these fishery independent information on recruits and spawning stock from trawl surveys that are designed and by our fisheries department and carried out independently by contracting industry to do the surveys. This continues our series on production forward, and we can see that following the cyclone we had a recovery in the landings and at the same time as we got recovery in the nursery habitats. And if we look at these fishery independent data, we can see that at the time of the cyclone, shown by the vertical dashed lines, we had good numbers of recruits and a very healthy spawning stock on the right-hand side within the system. Immediately following the cyclone, we see a major crash in the spawning stock and a decline in the recruits for several years before their recovery as the seagrass recovered in the system. So that's an example of a data-rich system. I'd like to now turn to an example of a small-scale fishery within the Australian context, and this is blue swimmer crabs. It's one of 4 species in the Portunus pelagicus complex. Within the commercial fisheries, we have the blue swimmer crabs are typically fished by small vessels, and in the estuaries and embayment coastal areas, these are small-scale fisheries that are fished by traps, very similar to what happens in the Indonesian waters. And I'll just show you a short video of the commercial operation. So there's only 1 or 2 people operating on the boat. You can see the traps being pulled on board and the crabs coming from the traps. So this particular fishery, we have information on data and catches coming from the commercial operators, but we have a very significant recreational fisheries in Western Australia, particularly for blue swimmer crabs, and the total crab catches from boats is estimated at about 900,000 crabs. Rec fishers fish 24 hours a day, but they also fish using small scoop nets in shallow waters, and we don't have any information on the scale of this scoop net fishery, except that it's very significant. In terms of data poor fisheries or data limited fisheries, how do we define them? These are fisheries in which we don't have a time series of fishery dependent or fishery independent data. And they're ones in which we're not able to do a quantitative stock assessment based on biomass. because we don't have the time series for catch and effort, or we don't have enough capacity in terms of people with the expertise to implement these sophisticated models, or we don't have the funding to collect this information. So we cannot estimate the biomass in the population or the biomass at maximum sustainable yield, or the biomass in the population now compared with what it was prior to fishing. In terms of data limited fisheries, many of these are small scale fisheries, and these can be defined by vessel sizes, such as in Indonesia, a vessel of less than 10 gross tonnes is classified as small scale fishery operation. They may also be multi-species fisheries or species caught in a number of different fisheries. So we don't have the catch or the time series for all the fisheries within the operation. And as we've seen in the Australian context, recreational fisheries are very much an example of data limited fisheries, but also small scale operations. And the issues that we face with these small-scale fisheries are that they involve large numbers of people. It's very difficult to manage and get information to large numbers of people. There's a large unreported catch, so we have uncertainty about what the take is. And for Indonesia, marine fisheries, small-scale fisheries are very, very large and significant. So how do we obtain data from these fisheries and assess them? How do we communicate to fisheries, to fishers and the governments for effective management? And how can we evaluate the effectiveness of different management measures? These are some of the challenges that we face. So just to sum up briefly on this component so far before we turn to Indonesian fisheries in particular, biological information is fundamental to our understanding of species being fished, and this helps us understand how much might be removed without affecting the population or the fishery. We also need indicators for not just the fishery, but the population that is being fished, and this can include indicators of abundance, biomass, spawners or recruits. And people are a very important part of the system, and we need indicators for the people. So I have summarised a number of questions that you might like to think about following this presentation on the fisheries, which include how we manage population sustainability, what are the major threats to maintaining viable populations, how the goals of management have changed over time and what this means for research and management into the future, and then also what are the major stages of development for fisheries and how do they differ between unmanaged and managed fisheries and between high value fisheries and lower value fisheries. So I'd now like to turn to Indonesian small-scale and data-limited fisheries and consider how we might assess and manage these fisheries, with two examples coming from shark and grouper snapper fisheries. And this is work that's been carried out by two of my PhD graduates, Vanessa Jata and Abdul Halim. As I started to engage with Indonesia and become involved back in 2012, like most Australians, I knew where Bali was and I knew where Jakarta was, but I didn't know much about the Coral Triangle region, eastern Indonesia, which is a very large proportion of the Indonesian EEZ. It's also a very significant fisheries in this region, but also very significant region from biodiversity. And this has been recognised globally as a significant fisheries hotspot. So the Coral Triangle region was identified by Wone and Branch in 2012 as a significant hotspot for fisheries management, because on the top left-hand side, because of the extensive number of islands within the region, the high population density that made management very difficult. So management effectiveness was shown in red, as it's also a region of great biodiversity, shown on the top right, where we see this very red zone through the Coral Triangle region, where we have over 2,000 species recorded. And it's one in which our catches had declined since the 1990s, but there's actually been some increase in catches since then. So Worm and Branch put these layers together to define global hotspots around the world, and this region in Indonesia is one of the 5 global hotspots they identified. In terms of evaluating shark fisheries, when we were considered developing Vanessa's PhD program, we had discussions with MMAF, and there was particularly pasca.ut, and it was recognised that there was very little knowledge of this Eastern Indonesian zone. So Vanessa worked in 3 shark and lived in 3 shark fishing communities, one in Pulau Ossi near Seram in the top in green, which is a gillnet fishery in the Halmahera region. The second was in the Dobo region, shown in blue on the right-hand side, gillnets and longlines near Papua. And then the third was a shark fishery, Papala and Rote, using long lines to fish for sharks in the Australian, Indonesian shared fishery zone within Australian waters. The approach that was used was lines of evidence using any available information from government statistics. It also used any length measurement data from non-government agencies. It has included interviews and data that the fishers themselves have collected, and interviews with fishers, which is building in anthropological expertise to try and understand fisheries. On the right-hand top right, we see Vanessa showing fishers how to measure sharks and rays. In the middle, this is Vanessa conducting interviews, and then below, an assistant in the project conducting interviews that went for up to 2 hours to understand the fishers' perceptions on changes in the shark fisheries. The second component of this interview, putting together information on the life history dynamics from wherever we could find it. Fish base, combined with the R package Fish Life, we were able to extract information on shark species. We did a major literature search on sharks, and we also used some empirical relations that have been developed by Frost and Binelon to get information on size at maturity and maximum size. And last week we did an assessment of stocks. We had planned to use the length-based spawning potential ratio, which I'll refer to later, and one that's used on the groper and snapper fisheries, but we used an assessment method of reproductive maximum potential for sharks because we had less information on lengths to get an idea of the status of the shark stocks. So as I mentioned, Vanessa spent significant time in the shark fishing communities. She talked with fishers. She trained them actually how to measure and in sharks and rays, and had them recording information for her. And I'll just show a a video now of Vanessa working with the shark fishers to take measurements for her and record data for her. Note that this video does show shark finning and it shows a shark dissection. So this is Vanessa on the shark fishing vessel from the Pulau Aussie Fishers near Seram, and this is showing the shark finning operation. They use gill nets. They're away for 3 to 4 weeks. They're not able to keep the catch. This is the length recording, how to record the length measurements, which was the least caudal fork measurement. The fishers recording those measurements. Then we have how we determine the sex and measuring the claspers of the male shark, and then dissecting a female shark to look at whether it is reproductive, mature, and has embryos or eggs within the body. So this program across the 3 communities resulted in 3,000 sharks being caught and measurements recorded for nearly 2,000 individuals, or 60%. And the accuracy of the identification was confirmed with genetic studies. And the shark fishers were very good at determining the species identification. They were able to identify 3 groups, but not able to identify species within the hammerhead group, the black-tipped reef sharks, or the gulper sharks, the deep water gulper sharks shown here. We're next going to look at the numbers caught from the 3 different, recorded by the 3 different fishing communities and their classification under the ICUN threatened species classification. So the major species caught was the green reef shark, Carcharinus amblyrhynchos, caught in gill nets by the Aussie fishers. And this shows the other species caught, but of particular interest are the hammerheads, which are classified as critically endangered. This is a species that was caught by all 3 communities, but particularly by the dobo fishers and the propeller fishers, but also the giant shovel-nosed rays, which is classified as vulnerable, and the sandbar sharks also classified as vulnerable. If we look at the length distribution compared with our information on size at maturity from the literature, you can see that the length of most species is less than 1.5 metres or 150 centimetres, which is around the central point of the size at maturity estimates for one of the species of hammerheads, the scalloped hammerhead. The broad range is because we're considering all studies and all species of hammerheads shown here. So this is an indication that we're catching quite a proportion of sharks at a size before they've matured to be able to give birth to the replacement sharks within the population. The other case study from Indonesia that I'd like to consider comes from the PhD studies of Abdul Halim, which were completed at EPB University, with information coming from data collected by the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Nature Conservancy. So Halim had 3 major components in his PhD. The first was an analysis of policy to consider definitions of small-scale fisheries. The second which we'll focus on, is assessment of the biological sustainability of the assessment of the snapper and groper using the length-based spawning potential ratio. And the third was an evaluation of fisheries management rights as a potential management measure for these fisheries. In terms of the assessment, like Vanessa's approach for sharks, we used a weight of evidence approach, which included assembling information from different data sources, but it also included informal discussions with collectors and fishers, and then an application of the length-based spawning potential ratio. So on the top right-hand side, there's Halim and I with the major collector in Sumbawa Besar. And then on the bottom right-hand side, we had a meeting with a fishers cooperative in Salah, which was quite revealing in terms of their perceptions on the fishery and how that had been changing over time. In terms of the length-based approach and why we use it, I'd like Professor Jeremy Prince has made a major contribution here in terms of developing this strategy, and he was a supervisor of Adrian Hordate with me, who developed the length-based approach. But the spawning potential ratio or spawning per recruit approach really looks at the proportion of unfished spawning left in the population under different harvesters. And this SPR, or spawning potential ratio, is recognised in international law in the United States, in the European Union, Australia and New Zealand. And it's a fishing intensity-based harvest strategy rather than a biomass harvest strategy. So it's particularly applicable for data-limited situations. We also have reference points that are generally accepted for fish or teleos species with a limit reference point of about 20%, which is where major management intervention is required, and a target reference point of SPR of 40%, which is what we'd like the population to be at to ensure sustainable fishing for teleos fish. There's a lot of information on this approach at the Barefoot Ecologist Toolbox, which Jeremy has developed, and that's freely available at the barefootecologist.com.au URL shown here. In terms of these reference points, what do they mean and how do we track them? It's possibly, if we look at human populations, we can liken the SPR to the number of children that a couple or a family have. So we have more than 2 children per couple in the top, shown in green. We see an increase in generations over time, and we see on a larger scale population growth. And I think you'll see that this is probably analogous to the Indonesian situation, where we have a growing population. In the middle of this, we see 2 children per couple. There's a replacement level in the population. We see a stable population over time. And this is what we see in countries like Australia or in some of the European countries. If we have less than 2 children per couple or per family, at the bottom there, shown in red, we see population decline. And so this is where countries like China, which has had a one-child policy, but also countries like Japan, where we see declining population growth. And if we apply this thinking to the spawning potential ratio, if we have a spawning potential ratio greater than 20%, shown at the top, we have population growth, provided fishing is not great. If we have a spawning potential ratio of 20%, we have a stable population. And then if our spawning potential ratio is less than 20%, we're basically seeing in a situation of population decline. What does that look like? In a fish population, if we look at the length distribution of the species, the unfished population is shown in white, and this is the size structure of the unfished population. So we have large numbers of fish and large numbers of large fish on the right-hand side of this graph in white. If we have low levels of fishing, we're able to get a size distribution of the current population with fishing. We see that we have a slight reduction in the numbers within the population, and we see a slight shift to the left-hand side in terms of size. So the numbers have been reduced, but the size has been reduced. As we see an increase in fishing, we see a greater reduction in the numbers of fish, but also a greater reduction in the size distribution within the fishery. So we see growth in fishing, more fishing using different methods, and as we then see greater increases in fishing, we see a much greater reduction to a size distribution, which is now much more like the size at maturity, or less than the size at maturity, and much lower than the unfished population. And what we need to do in these circumstances is to try and rebuild the population so that we're at least getting a 20% spawning overall within the fish population, and potentially build it above that size to increase the numbers, but also the size of the species within the population. If we apply this to the grouper and snapper fisheries, Halim looked at two systems, Teluk Sala in Sumbawa, shown in the green, which is mainly a handline and speargun fishery, and a handline fishery in purple, deeper water fishery for snapper, mainly in Rote and Papella. And this shows the methods in Teluk Sala, the spear guns, the hand line and the long lines. 3 of the target species where we had large numbers of length measurements were the Plectropomus species and Variola species. These are all ceranids in Sala Bay, whereas in Kupang and Roti we had deeper water snapper and deeper water Epinephelus areolatus within this. The indicators that were looked at in terms of the length-based spawning potential ratio were the length distribution and size at maturity, the size selectivity, which is the size at which the species are caught, and also the fishing mortality and natural mortality and the ratio of fishing mortality to natural mortality. And then lastly, an indicator of the health of the population, the spawning potential ratio. This shows the length distribution and the fit of the modelled length distribution to the species in Sala Bay. You can see large numbers of length measurements, a good fit by the model, shown by the black line, to the actual observed measurements for all 3 species, and that most of these species are somewhere between 300 and 400 millimetres in size. In terms of Kupang and Rote data, we've seen more variability in the length measurements and not quite as good a fit from the model to the length distributions, but also for the Lucanus gibbus and Lucanus bouton, the smaller sizes are caught within this fishery compared with Sala Bay, but also with the Epinephelus areolatus, which is largely between 300 and 400 millimetres. In terms of the indicators, the size selectivity, where 50% of the catch is caught, we're looking to try and ensure that the size of selectivity is greater than the length, the size at maturity, where 50% of the individuals are caught, are mature. We'd like a fishing mortality to natural mortality ratio of less than 1. And we'd like the spawning potential ratio to be around 40% as a target, but definitely above the limit SPR of 20%. This shows how the indicators compare. So on the left, this first indicator that we're looking at is with selectivity shown by the vertical black lines. This is 50% selectivity compared with the size at 50% maturity shown by the crosses. And that for 4 of the species across both regions, we see that the size of the selectivity is much lower than the size at maturity, particularly for the species of groper, leopardus and maculatus. So the selectivity is less than 300 millimetres, but the size at maturity is 375 to 400 millimetres. Whereas we see less cause concern for one of the legonid species and the Epinephrylus, where the size at selectivity, the horizontal lines are above the size at maturity. If we look at our indicator of fishing mortality to natural mortality, you can see that we're seeing a much greater ratio than 1 for many of the species. So we're above the target that we'd like to be at. And then lastly, how does the health of the population compare with our indicators of spawning potential ratio? You can see that 5 of the species are below our limit SPR of 20%, and that only 1 species is above it. So we have our indicator of fishing showing that we may have too high a fishing occurring. We have our indicator of the health of the population, the SPR, showing that the population has been fished down to low levels. So in terms of the question that we have then, based on this, you might like to consider and discuss afterwards, what is the status of the fishery and groper and snapper fisheries, and what is the status of shark fisheries, and what management options might be viable for these fisheries. And in fact, these were topics that were major topics within the workshops and proceedings for those species. And we considered those and different management strategies and options that could be considered. And so things that emerged from this workshop across the 7 species were that size limits might be effective, and we should consider increasing minimum sizes to above the size at maturity for 50% of the population. It was also considered that changing access within the population through closing seasons at peak spawning time or closing areas to conserve nurseries or spawning habitats would be valuable to consider, and that limiting fishing effort may be an effective means of reducing the take from the fisheries. And this all fed into how the harvest strategies might be considered for the different species. Our discussions from these workshops indicated that it would be difficult to implement catch quotas under the fisheries, under these fisheries. But in terms of try and sum up overall, small-scale fisheries are very significantly globally. They're very significant in Indonesia. They're very significant for recreational fisheries in Australia. And these are fisheries that are often data limited or data poor, which means we need to consider different methods of data collection and different methods of analysis for these fisheries. There's a high need for biological information within Indonesia and to establish a time series of data for fish stocks within Indonesia. But it also means that we need different ways of approaching fisheries and different sources of information for these fisheries. Another means of capturing that information, which I think is very powerful, is to consider fisheries as a management system, consider the management objectives, but also considering bringing different disciplines to our approaches to ensuring sustainable fisheries. And this means that collaboration, partnerships and knowledge sharing is very important across government, universities, non-government organisations, fishers, the fishing industry and fishing communities more broadly. So, terima kasih banyak. Particularly like to acknowledge my Indonesian friends and colleagues and close collaborators, Pak Budi, Dr. Halim, Irfan Yulianto, Pak Fayakun, my Australian colleagues and PhD students, and all the participants in workshops, and like to thank you for participating in this masterclass and thank Agnes and Universitas Terbuka for the opportunity to talk with you today. So just to highlight, a list of references are available in the PowerPoint, and some of these are also available in what I've shared with Ibu Agnes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Neil, for your fruitful, inspiring presentation. And I would like to participant in this webinar to feel free to ask the question directly. Oh, there is one. Is from Ibu Maya Puspitasari.
Thank you so much, for Agnes, and thank you, Professor Neil, for giving us such interesting presentation. As someone who's not familiar with the fishery, because I'm from English education program, so please bear with me with by asking, I think, some silly questions. I have 4 questions here. The first one about, you mentioned that Indonesia has quite diversities of fish, and I read in, if I'm not mistaken, in wildlife that 1/3 of freshwater fish are threatened to extinction. So, because to be honest, I don't like fish. So if it's extinct, so what? If is there anything that can threaten our life as human being? If the population of fish, for example, extinct. And my second question is about, I think that it will be my first questions. What makes you interested in fisheries? What makes you fall in love? Is there anything that memorable in your childhood that makes you interested in studying fisheries? And then,
yes.
Okay, I would like you to share.
Okay, I'll start with the second one first.
Okay.
So I have a passion for the marine environment. I love diving and snorkeling. And so that was my start. And then that developed into an interest in understanding biodiversity and the marine environment. And then that led to fisheries and how we can ensure sustainable fisheries. And then understanding people and the people dynamic and how people behave and respond has been very interesting. So I loved talking with fishers in Indonesia and Australia through Pak Halim and learning about how they fish, why they fish, and their knowledge of the system. And there's a lot of information to be gained from fishers. Your first question was about the value of fish and fisheries and what does it mean if something goes extinct. Seafood is a very important source of nutrition for coastal fishes and coastal communities. So it goes beyond that. It's a very valuable protein source, a very valuable source of nutrients. So it has value from those perspectives, but it also has significant value in terms of biodiversity conservation. So it has a right to exist, and this is becoming more and more important from the Rio Biodiversity Pact signed way back in the 1990s. So this has been increasingly important, and it's been recognised as we move to ecosystem-based fisheries management. Okay.
Can I move on to the next question?
No, I think there's other questions. I think we need to.
Okay.
Is that okay, Ibu Agnes?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Bu Maya, maybe you can keep your question later after we invite the other participant. Okay. Please, Mr. Royan, to ask the question. Is still mute? You can turn on the microphone. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Agnes. Hi, Mr. Neil. I'm Ryan, and I'm student in Open University Indonesia. I'm work in Ministry of Marine and Fisheries Indonesia. So the simple question, I hear that lobster Panulirus management in Australia get big success to manage to be continue or good stock, but in Indonesia too difficult to get success with like Australia. So my question, what is key point to make it success? Thank you.
Thank you, Royan. You're correct. The Western rock lobster is considered an example of best practice fisheries management globally. It is the first fishery that obtained Marine Stewardship Council certification, which recognises the sustainability of the fishery, but also the sustainability of its impact on other parts of the marine environment. Now, working in Indonesia, we cannot transport knowledge from Australia directly to Indonesia because you have many more people, as you're well aware, that you understand. And so it is more complex, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. So one of the important things is Indonesia is to understand the supply chain and value chain. So, for example, in lobster, the lobster fishers provide it to a collector who may then transport it to a major middleman, and then it goes to the company, the processing plant. And by working with some of these people in the supply chain so that they understand the sustainability issues, means that you may be able to increase size limits, provided they're supportive of that, because they're buying the catch and controlling what they take into the processing. So that's why I said at the end, we need to have many people, not just the ministry involved in the management, it's also seeking collaborations. And in fact, in those data limited workshops, there were many good examples of those collaborations for the groper and snapper fisheries, for the shark fisheries. It's happening with blue swimmer crab as well, I think. Harvest strategies are being developed. And so I think that lobster would be one where that would be definitely worth looking at.
Okay, I get a point, sir.
Sorry, can you tell me which part of MMAF are you at? Central government or provincial or?
I'm in North Sumatra.
North Sumatra.
I get job as officer responsible in Nias Island.
Very interesting.
So many lobster there. At least 6 species maybe. So the best is yeah. And last year I sent for 10,000 piece to Jakarta, and now it's decreased maybe cause many problem in supply of petrol to fishermen.
Okay, thank you, Royan. I think we need to check others, but very interesting to talk with you.
So my pleasure. I wait you there.
There is an invitation for Neil to come to Nias.
Well, I have not been to Sumatra yet.
Yeah, actually, because Prof. Neil is already going to the northeastern part of Indonesia. Yeah.
So notice me to ministry, Mr. Neil, to guide you in Nias.
Terima kasih.
Okay.
Okay, terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Royan. There is some question come up from the chat room. Could you please, Risma, share the? I will share the question. This is the question, Prof. Neil. Could you read it?
Yes. So the question from
Tilma Komaling from Tuna Consortium.
From the Tuna Consortium.
Consortium, yeah.
So
this is about the collecting data.
The question is about data. So learned that data is essential for sustainable fisheries.
Yeah.
But collecting data can be very costly and expensive. Yeah. So any advice on the scheme of data collection, funding or financing? Any best practice or lesson learned from Australia or other countries? Okay. So it's a very important question. How do we get data?
The data.
So Indonesia actually has some very good data collection places in practice. And this has involved non-government organisations. For example, with tuna, MDPI has played a very important role in getting data collection systems up and going and sharing data with MMAF on tuna, on various parts of the tuna fisheries within Indonesia. And MDPI has worked with MMAF and worked with the fishers and fishers communities, and they've been successful in getting funding from donors to help with data collection. That ongoing data collection is then the challenge then, how you keep the data collection system going. In Australia, we have various programs for wreck fishing is our big challenge. So this is where we have so many individuals, so diffuse, and we don't have license systems. So what we endeavour to do is create a system where fishers volunteer to collect information and provide it to government. And that is generally run by government and relies on the fishers engaging with a program. But it very much depends on understanding the fishery, who's involved in the fishery and who has influence on the fishery and where the data might best be collected and gathered. Thank you for your question, Thelma.
Thank you, Pak Neil.
Agnes, you're on mute.
Still on mute. Ibu Tilma, would you want to edit some question or clarification?
Yes, if I may, sorry if the background noises, but thank you, Panil, for the answer. But I think also from the institution that helps the government on collecting data, the funding is finite. So I was just wondering if there's any lesson learned from other countries that we can apply. The fact that I think the fact of the fishers would be volunteering of collecting data is something quite permanent, and it can be sustainable. But how do we go through the path of, advocating both the government and as well to the fishers on to make it, as a voluntary based data collection? So that will be, if there's any experience from your side, if anything that you know, please do advise. Thank you, Panil.
Thank you, Thelma. You're absolutely correct. The thing is to make sure that these systems are ongoing and sustainable. And that means that when the system's developed and if it's implemented by an agency outside government, there has to be a plan for handover to government, and government needs to recognise the resources that are needed to keep the system going. So it is a complex system, and this is one in which it's not just the researchers that need to be involved, it's the managers and the policy makers need to be engaged. And it's one in which I talked about transdisciplinary. So there's a field of research which is behavioural change, and there's experts in that field that add significant value in understanding this sort of question. Yeah.
Okay, Pak. Thank you so much. Terima kasih, Bu Agnes.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Tilma, Prof. Neil. Are there any question from the floor? I think I have one question from me. Can I? I wonder that, in Australia, you mentioned about the recreational fisheries, yeah, is better known. Australia is, but in Indonesia is not widely common. Why there is some factor that affect that one kind of things?
Yes, recreational fishery is very, very popular in Australia, and it's related to our livelihoods and income. So in Australia, and our work conditions, so people have more leisure time. We only work, in theory, a 5-day week, 37.5 hours. And I know that's very different in Indonesia. When many people are working 7 days and many, many hours in a week.
Yeah, okay.
And this means there is no time for leisure or recreation and no time for recreational fishing. But it's quite interesting, Ibu Agnes, in China and South Korea, 10 to 15 years ago, there was very little leisure or recreational fishing. But as the standard of living has increased in China and Indonesia, in China and South Korea, recreational fishing has also increased. So people have more money and more time to engage in leisure activities. So I think that's when you're more worried about providing food on the table or income for your family to live, you don't have time to worry about fishing for fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually. Yeah. Okay. There is one more. Is from Pak Toto Hardianto. Would you please to ask the question directly? Still mute, Pak Toto. Hello.
Maybe not here.
Yeah, maybe not here. Yeah. Okay. I think because the time is we are limited of time constraint. Is there any one? Oh no. Okay. Because okay. Now we are just a minute. The time is up. We would like to thank Prof. Neil, who has been pleased to share his knowledge with all of us. And before we close the presentation for today, could you please, all the audience, take a photo session, Prof. Neil? Do you mind? Before we are closing, because your input is 1 hour. Is now, what time is it in Perth?
It's 1:10 nearly. So we're 1 hour.
Yeah, I know. It's time to have your lunch. Okay. Prisma, would you please to guide the photo session?
Okay.
With all the audience.
Bapak dan Ibu, please be prepared to take photo. We have 4 slides to capture it. Please turn on the camera. In 3, 2, 1. Next slide. 3, 2, 1. Next slide. 3, 2, 1. And the last slide. 3, 2, 1. Finish, Bagus.
Okay. Thank you for audience and participants in this webinar. To all participants, please complete the attendance list and evaluation link that has in chat room. We will send the certificate to your email after you fill in the complete evaluation link. For Professor Neil, thank you again for your time to share.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
To our knowledge to this presentation. I hope you don't mind if we join again in the next session. And I would like to thank to Dr. Siti Juleha, our head director of Universitas Terbuka, and during the visiting professor organized by Fisheries Management Master Program. Thank you for all participants who had already joined and give your active question and participation from morning to this afternoon. I hope you enjoy and get knowledge from our visiting professor. And thanks again for Professor Neil. We hope you enjoy the seminar and everybody have an insightful session of today. And hope we can join in the next event that organized by Universitas Terbuka Graduate Universitas Terbuka Master Program. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day. See you in the next event. Thank you.